Okay, welcome everyone to the Great Unlearn. Today's guest is an old college buddy of mine. When I say old, I mean it's been over 25 years since we left the great Amherst College. So today I want to welcome on Luke Ryan to the Great Unlearn. And just as a bit of background on Luke, Luke's dad and grandfather were both judges. And he has said that he grew up with this kind of sense of certain rights and wrongs, adding that his father impressed upon him that the state, you sometimes you just can't do anything about those outside voices, right?
It's on brand.
I love it. I love it. But his father impressed upon him that the state can yield a lot of power against the individual. And I think we're seeing that in large degree right now, but it really paints a lot of the work that Luke has done. So I think it's important to recognize that. Now, also at the age of 16, Luke's best friend committed suicide. And that is something that, Luke and I were college roommates, and I knew nothing about that. And so I think, again, that's an important part of his life that we'll get into later on in the episode. By the time he got to Amherst in 1990, Luke, self-proclaimed, didn't have a drugs and alcohol problem as much as a drugs and alcohol solution. And so we'll get into that as well later on into the episode. Now, fortunately, by the age of 26, he found sobriety and got involved with a church ministry group that was more than tapped into racial justice. Through that group, he realized that white privilege kept him from becoming a convict, and he has stated, I'd like to say, there, but for the grace of God, go I. But I think it's more there, but for the grace of privileges I received due to my race and socioeconomic status, go I. I was permitted to have this kind of sowing of wild oats stage in my life that so many of my clients are not given. So I think in addition to having empathy, there's a debt that I feel. And so I think a lot of us probably listening today understand that we've been given a long leash to sow those wild oats without any repercussions. Now, Luke entered the Western New England College School of Law at the ripe old age of 30 and graduated magna cum laude in 2005. In 2016, Luke was recognized as a Massachusetts super lawyer and began serving on the board for the Massachusetts Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. That same year, he received the Edward J. Dugan Award for zealous advocacy and outstanding legal services to the poor. In 2017, Massachusetts Lawyers Weekly selected Luke as one of its Lawyers of the Year. Now, how did Luke earn all these prestigious awards? You can look no further than his incredibly inspiring work on the 4-part Netflix series titled How to Fix a Drug Scandal. That's how Luke and I reconnected. I was watching, like everybody else in the nation, about Joe Exotic and Carol Baskin. And when that series was over, I'm like, what else is on?
Mhm.
And I looked at the trailer to How to Fix a Drug Scandal, and I saw Luke, who at that point is bald, as you see if you're watching on the YouTube right now. Uh, and I was like, I told Peyton, my wife, I think that's my old college roommate. And so I end up watching it, and sure enough, it's Luke. And not only, he had a bit part in the trailer, but a really incredible part throughout the whole series. He's the main lawyer involved, representing both Rolando Panate and Rafael Rodriguez, but he ends up representing thousands more. So anyway, that's a very long introduction, but I think it's important to get a lot of that out on the table so that Luke and I can get into the juicy stuff. And within that, I want to talk about the Netflix series for one. I want to talk about the effects of losing your friend to suicide at the age of 16. I want to know what happened at the age of 26 that created that shift in you where something had to change. And I really, for someone who's on the inside, I want to know more about the racial and socioeconomic inequity that you see on a daily basis in the criminal justice system. And we are going to talk about white privilege. And you and I have talked about it a little bit on the phone, but I think you have some really valuable insights for someone who's been working under that awareness for a long time, where I think many of us, and I will speak for myself in particular, I'm just starting to own that part of who I am. And I think certainly with everything that's going on today, it's important that we have that discussion. So anyway, without further ado, thanks for coming on, brother. It's great to see you.
It is absolutely my pleasure. So thank you for having me.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about. I mean, I mentioned your dad and your granddad, but one of the things in you've talked about it in many interviews you've been in, that you didn't take many breaths, I think, in college without a few drinks, and so that's how you and I mean, we partied a lot. Um, we technically both played on the golf team together. I was uh, a little bit more than a glorified caddy, but in any event, we had this particular college experience, and I think that even through all that, and you were one of the greatest all-time smartasses I've ever met, and it does come out in the Netflix series, which I was great to see that you haven't let go of that.
Hmm.
Um, but I always had this sense that you did have this idea of right and wrong, and there were times when I know that you called me out for a comment that I would make and be like, yeah, no, that's not okay. Like, you're grouping everyone together, and that's just a stereotype, and that's not even right. And so of all the things I remember of our time spent together in college, those are the things that stand out. And to see you take that to a much larger degree, and was amazing for me to see on the Netflix series, and then obviously the conversation we had afterwards was great for us to catch up. But I'd love to kind of have that come out a little bit more for everyone to hear. So I guess just more
Sure.
about that sense of right and wrong.
Yeah. So I did have an upbringing that was law was kind of in the air that I breathed. My dad was a lawyer for as long as I can remember. He was a district attorney, he was a judge. And when he would come home at the end of the day, he would kind of relive his day. And it was all about these kind of courtroom dramas and these moments where kind of justice hung in the balance. So I don't think I was ever like, oh, that's what I'm going to do. Um, in fact, I was pretty sure that I did not want to be a lawyer. And the time that we knew each other, there was no part in my brain that I was thinking, oh, someday I'm just looking forward to take the LSATs and go to law school.
Yeah.
But I definitely think it was formative, and it was the sort of thing where um, it was formative in a couple of different ways. One, in the sense that when I eventually decided that this was something that I wanted to do, and kind of had an epiphany that a law degree would help people that I cared about. As I entered into that arena, like it kind of made sense. Like the law, uh, it was a language that I had been spoken around me for a period of time. And then the other way that you alluded to it, that it was formative, was I think people just had expectations of me that allowed me to kind of flounder for a period of time without kind of losing the ability to then one day, as I'm in my mid or late 20s, where I could make that kind of decision, and certain doors hadn't already been closed to me because of of choices I'd been making. So that was really the backdrop for what I think it was being around people who cared about the law and knew about the law, and impressed upon me on some kind of, I don't know, cellular level, this idea that the law could be a force for good. And then um, I think it was it gave me um, it just gave me a chance to be around people who oftentimes I think people become who we think they can be. And it's the rare individual who can kind of rise above or below their circumstances. And I tried very hard to rise or sink beneath my
Yeah.
circumstances for a
Yeah.
long period of time. And then eventually, was put in a position where I could kind of flourish.
Yeah, and I think you've you've made reference to that as well. Like no matter kind of how much you fucked up, like the doors weren't closing, and I think that's something that we, I certainly have taken for granted. And I my use of psychedelics is one example. Sure, they're legal in some states, but I've been using them long before that, and in other things that like just the I don't even think twice about it. I really don't. And so that's the stuff that, and we'll get into more of the two gentlemen that you represented. And I think just what Rolando in particular was thrown in jail for is just it's just a great example of how what the inequity is. But without getting too far kind of ahead of myself here, I did love in the Netflix series, and it was in the beginning of the second episode, where you're like, yeah, when I became an attorney, like I knew I didn't want to do defense. And then, like, what was the epiphany there? I mean, I know it because I heard it, but for people who haven't seen the series, like, what was it that inspired you?
Well, by the time I got to law school, you had mentioned I'd been a part of this kind of church ministry group, and they had a very active racial justice component to it. And I was doing a lot of independent reading. I mean, I spent um, our time together in college. Really, I think any state school in the country I would have been kicked out of. There was rampant grade inflation at Amherst, and
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
in a way that was is it would be shocking, I think, to a lot of people listening. But in any event, once I kind of got my footing, I embarked on this late 20s period where I was just reading a lot of Martin Luther King. And when you read King, you end up reading a lot of Gandhi. And when you read Gandhi, you end up reading a lot of Tolstoy. And so by the time I got to law school, the church group I was involved in was had an African American ministry team, and they had some land that they owned, and they were just being treated unfairly. And we were having all these meetings about what to do, and I woke up one day and was like, "This would be a great time to be a lawyer. It would be a great time to be able to walk into court and file something and have a case and argue." So I think once I kind of had that realization that the law could be a force for good, that I wanted to do this. Um, at that point, I think it became a process that I was still wed to this idea that Gandhi's one of his best books is The Story of My Experiment with the Truth, and I really thought what needs to come out in this particular conflict that I'm seeing is the truth. And the way that I looked at criminal defense was that was not a search for the truth. That was a search, if you're a defense lawyer, for some loophole to get your client off and to find some technicality. And so I had what I think a lot of people had in terms of misconceptions about that profession. So as I went to law school, I was thinking that I know what I don't want to do, and I don't want to be a criminal defense attorney. So, um, and as I was finishing law school, I had a chance to clerk for a federal judge in Springfield, a man named Michael Ponzer. And for people who have a chance to have that kind of experience, I would highly recommend it, because in addition to having a first client who was a brilliant person, and if I kind of screwed up, it wasn't like he was going to go to jail. He'd just kind of be like, "Oh no, that opinion you wrote where you cited that case, I think that might have been overturned with another case." But I got to see all of these different cases that would come through, and I got to see different attorneys appear and argue them. And one of the attorneys that I saw was a guy named David Hoos, who was a criminal defense attorney. And boy, was he impressive. And he was, sometimes you find people in your life and you're just like, wow, I want to be like you.
Yeah.
And it wasn't so much what he was doing as a criminal defense attorney. It was the way he carried himself. It was his just presence in a courtroom and a way of representing a client who was clearly in a difficult spot. And so I was lucky enough when my clerkship was ending, he was in a place in his career where he was looking to bring somebody in and kind of teach the next generation of criminal defense attorneys. So that's how I ended up doing what I was doing. It was definitely not the thing that I kind of thought I was getting into when I submitted my law school application.
Yeah, and I think just from my own experience, like when I think about a defense attorney, yeah, I think about the guy who got the killer off or the rapist off on a technicality because of police work or whatever, and it's like, how can you live with yourself? But there, as the documentary does an amazing job, there are millions of people that are underserved in that capacity. And so I think when you look at it through that lens, it's like, oh yeah, that's a not to judge noble, not noble, but it feels there's a whole different bent to it, with
Yeah,
regards to that.
yeah. I mean, most of the time when I represent somebody who is guilty, um, it's pretty obvious that they're guilty. It's the borderline cases are, um, those are not the norm. So a lot of times somebody comes in and they say they're innocent and they are innocent, and other times they come in and say, "Look, I did this. I got caught doing it," and it becomes the work of a criminal defense attorney. It overlaps with like social work in a lot of ways. So you have these people who come before you and they've got this legal problem, and sometimes the legal problem is the tip of the iceberg, and a defense attorney does very little service for their client if that's all they're focused on. If they look at a person and say, "Oh, here's a law school problem," this is a human being who often is in a position because of terrible things that have happened to them. The system has failed them innumerable times, innumerable ways. And my job becomes to kind of excavate that and figure out, how did this person get to this spot where they're now charged with a serious crime? What were the turning points in this person's life? And what are the places down the road? What are the things that I can help this person do to address the root causes so that we can go into court and say, look, yes, this happened, and yes, that was bad, but here's a plan for moving forward that is rehabilitative and isn't as punitive, and in a way that can serve them and it can serve the community.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, or at least I'll speak for myself. What I'm seeing right now is I'm really I feel like I'm attuned to the people who are pointing out that the protests and that they're making it about the looting and stuff like that. Okay, now we know there are bad actors out there, whether it's Antifa, whoever, but nevertheless, it it's a symptom of a problem. The symptom is there's some stuff getting burned down, and all that's not good, but it's getting people's attention to, hopefully, we think the idea is getting people's attention to the root of the problem, and that's the inequity that that I think a lot of us are finally starting to wake up to, and owning and knowing that just because we've been privileged doesn't, it's like you can't stay silent. Like the silence, and I do finally believe this, the silence is really just, you know almost advocating for the racist policies and the racist ideas, and we have to start to act in ways that are, that express anti-racist ideas and support anti-racist policies, and it's a process of learning and unlearning my own racist ideas. And I think if we can just start to own that and be okay with it and just forgive ourselves for that, we can start to actually do some good with it. Um, and so anyway, we can talk about that a little a little bit later. Um, but I really want to circle back to, um, again, I knew you for 3 years in college. We were off by a year, and I had no idea that you had lost a friend. And as if that wasn't hard enough, you described what you spent the next number of years of your life doing. And I just had never, everybody has their reasons for drinking and drugs and checking out. But it was really the first time I had ever heard kind of that experience. And so if you could just share that, I think it might shed some light into people where, again, people these are symptoms of a deeper problem for people. They just expresses as drugs and alcohol.
Right. And I think it's important to kind of at the outset say this, like, I'm going to share with you, the reasons why I took very few sober breaths for almost 10 years. But those reasons, I don't want it to be, oftentimes I think when white people discuss this has happened in the opioid crisis, where suddenly we're realizing, oh, this is a medical problem, this is a public health problem, as opposed to a criminal uh, issue in our society. So I think that the people that I represent who have issues with addiction, um, the early childhood trauma that I hear is way, way beyond what my own experience is. So, I mean, I think that it's important for me to kind of own and share what my own experience was, but I don't want it to be. I'm reluctant to think, oh, well, that excuses who I was, because so many people, it doesn't. At least the system doesn't excuse the ways in which they turn to what it really is street medicine for a lot of the people that I end up representing. So growing up, I had three younger sisters, and in sixth grade, a kid moved to town who was incredibly charismatic, and his name was Pete. He became my best friend for 5 years. We were just practically inseparable. We I think in about eighth grade, just to kind of give a couple examples of this, um, we started pooling our money. So every day we kind of take turns who the treasurer was, but every day one of us at homeroom would just empty our pockets, and the other person would carry our money for the day. And it would come to lunch and be like, "Hey, I need some money for some pretzels or something, a snack or something." And so that person would dig in their pocket, and that went all year long. That would be like he'd work more in the summers. He'd picking cucumbers, and he'd have more money in the summers. I would probably get more money from my parents for lunch money during the year, and so I'd have more. And we just realized, why should one of us have more than the other should have? And that translated to things like we grew up in a very small town. It was a farming town. There was not a single stoplight in the whole town. And when you walked home from the junior senior high school, you would walk by my house on the way to his, which was probably another 3/4 of a mile. And what we realized was it wasn't really fair that he would have to walk further than I would. So we would just keep on walking past my house. And we had this particular tree stump that we had kind of measured off as equidistant. And so every day we would just come to that spot, and one of us would, we'd pause to see if somebody could say some smart ass parting comment, and then walk back in the opposite directions. And the goal was not to race to see who would get back sooner. It was to see if we could reach our doors at the exact same time. So that's who he was for me. He was just this, he was a brother. He was somebody who I just, at his funeral said at the end of every day, like I would literally think like, I'd reached the capacity to love another person on the world. And this was, um, you know, and I can, to contextualize this is during like the 80s. This is like homophobia so thick that you
Mm.
couldn't turn a corner in that school without hearing somebody calling somebody else a fag. And it was really, really intense. And I think what had happened is we had just done these things that really should have exposed us for the tenor of the times to this kind of scrutiny. But it was so weird. I mean, we're sharing money with each other. We're acting like a married couple. And I think peers were just like confused by the whole thing and thinking, are they acting strategically in some way here? Am I going to out myself as a moron? And so we got this pass, but it was love. There's no other way to describe it. I just loved this guy. And um, 3 day, 3 days after sophomore year, we went out and we had stolen some beers and we got drunk. And um, he just made a choice that I was spur of the moment. I don't think was premeditated in any way, but he ended up taking his life, and it was uh, just something that changed the course of my life. It impacted me in a way that uh, it changed everything. It really did. And it continues to change everything. So this happened in the June of 1988, and I had 2 more years of high school to go, and we were both athletes. I was an athlete, and I think that I just basically decided the next 2 years I was going to work through all of this sorrow and grief and anger on playing fields, and I became kind of a monster in ways that were both, good in terms of my performance and just bad. Uh, I became the leading uh, soccer scorer in Western Massachusetts my junior year, and I tied with some other kid. I would have had, I'm sure, the 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 individual crown, but I got suspended for a game because I flipped the ref off in the middle of it. I was just this angry kid who got through the rest of high school through sports and then got to college, and it was like that's when you eventually you saw me, and I was just in the middle of um, self-medicating, mostly at the beginning with alcohol and then through with marijuana.
And to be fair, you didn't stand out from anybody else really in the crowd. I mean, drinking was very prevalent many nights of the week. And so it was very much accepted. And so, it was easy to think, oh, we're just all in this together, partying and doing just enough to kind of get grades that are fine until we're done. Um, but that wasn't the case with you. You weren't having the same experience as everyone else.
I mean, I think I was 18, I was 19, I was 20, and I don't think I was in touch with what I was the pain that I was experiencing, and I think that I was able to use alcohol in a way that helped me um, not deal with it. And to be fair, I wasn't ready to deal with it. I think sometimes um, substances are. I said, and you quoted at the beginning, they can be solutions as much as problems. Sometimes they create a lot of problems, but it can buy somebody some time. Sometimes that just this ability to uh, disassociate from a reality that's really painful is important, and it's what we use drugs for, over the counter drugs. That's why we take aspirin. We've got a headache, we want to change our reality. In the morning when I get up, I take caffeine in the form of coffee because I want to change my perception of reality. So I think that um, that's what I was doing, but I don't think I was in a place where I was ready to have that kind of self awareness.
Yeah, and I think it's such a almost a unique situation that it's almost like we don't know, or parents don't know, the community is not even sure how to help someone heal through that trauma. And so to see you go, headlong into sports and start to achieve these things, it's like, well, he's putting it to good use. And I think as we've gotten older, and again, like quite likely you're way too young to even begin to process that. But I think that happens in later in life for a lot of us, particularly men, where we think, we lose someone, or I shouldn't say we lose someone. Someone passes away, and we've got to be strong for the family. And I think
Yeah.
that's this notion that we can't grieve, or we shouldn't grieve. And I think bypassing that opportunity is an opportunity to heal that trauma and to acknowledge, like, this part of my life that this person was a part of is gone. It's died. Like, I need to, grieve that loss, that version of you, in a sense. Um, but I think one of
Yeah.
the things that struck me, Luke, is that you talked about almost the fragility of your relationships, in the sense that you felt like you had to show up for your friends because you were afraid of losing them. You're afraid of them something happening.
Yeah, in retrospect, it in addition to kind of turning to substances to kind of self medicate, I think my other strategy at that time in my life was, um, this was so painful, and I think the only way that I could kind of enter and build new friendships and really connect with people is if I had this agenda, um, of keeping them on the planet. And I think that what I ended up doing in a lot of male relationships moving forward was, uh, I would, kind of reflect the things that I liked in the friends that I had. And it might be a speech pattern or just a general kind of outlook. And I became kind of a mirror. I was like bouncing back this goodness that I saw in people, um, with an underlying goal of like letting them know, like, you, in ways that, males communicate. We don't communicate directly a lot, and this was a way to just help people like feel good about themselves, because I wanted to keep them on the planet, because I was scared of going through something so painful again. So it was one of those things that I think, you know I had moments in my life where I would develop these friendships, and then I'd have all these kind of friends from different circles come together, and it would create this identity crisis, because I was different with different friends in a way that made it difficult for them to be in the same room together, because they knew me in a different way. And I became, really self-conscious about that, because it was, I think, just that's how I got through a period of time and was able to, instead of, I think the alternative would have been to just go completely like hermit and shut out and say, I'm not going to have any friends, because that hurt too much. This was like, all right, I'll have friends, but I've got to go above and beyond for every friend that I have in a way that they'll feel, um, good enough that nothing like this will ever happen again.
Yeah, we talked about it before, but like so much for you to carry that you didn't even realize it, right? And so what was what was it that kind of brought that to your awareness that like, oh, this is what's been happening and allowed you to see that and to start to heal that?
I think I got to a point where, I mean, you referenced it. I mean, a lot of that early substance misuse or overuse was in these places where it was, they were parties. They were, this was, the whole, like, you were around people who were doing the same thing. There was a lot of laughing. There was a lot of just, joy. And I got out of that environment, and, I went to New York City for a few years, and then I went to different places. And but as I saw kind of people moving out of that, and I didn't have that same scene where I could kind of continue to do this, I became kind of frustrated in myself, and and it had just this kind of pain that became, it was just bubbling up, and what I was using to deal with the pain wasn't strong enough. So I came to a point where I was either going to need stronger medicine, or I was going to need to kind of treat what was ailing me. And fortunately, I opted for the latter and was able to kind of, um, have the space, that I needed at that point in my life um, to do some work that would put me on a path that I ended up on.
And tell me, and so let's like, what was it about the church ministry group that really held you, that allowed you to kind of go through the processes to heal? And I know we had talked about it a little bit before this, but there was a kind of a lot going on as well that was coming up for you in that time, not just healing this, but I think given white privilege and that you trying to sort through all that. And so it was a
Yeah, so it was a family church. The family was, the Andersons of Amherst, Massachusetts. Carlos Wayne Anderson was the minister at the church, and his sister Rhonda Gordon was the music minister. And so, Carlos was this unbelievably, um, just, it's hard to put into words. He spoke extemporaneously. He was a genius. He is a genius. He's still doing what he does, but he uh, really, I think, helped me have a very different understanding of my relationship with a creator or with the universe that felt like I know we're on the great unlearn here. Like that was an unlearn for me. Like I'd grown up in the Catholic Church, and I don't think I paid a lot of attention. I was an altar boy. I'd kind of go up there and daydream about God, but a lot of um, the air I was breathing in that venue really left me feeling very judgmental about myself, about other people, and so he and his just interpretation. Um, it was a Christian church, but it really honored all spiritual paths. So he was drawing from every tradition you could name, and I think the overall message was one that was it was about love, and it was about connecting with other people. And Rhonda, his sister, um, subscribed to that 100%, but she also was like, yeah, that connection that we all want to have with each other is impossible because of white supremacy, racism, white privilege. It is a barrier to those connections that we seek um, in a spiritual community. So she undertook this very brave project of trying to educate people like me about what our unearned white skin privilege meant, the ways in which we that impacted and caused us to enter into a place that you know didn't sufficiently honor the black leadership at the church, and took liberties that if you stopped and pulled back you could see. But we were all making mistakes, and it was a place where uh, you were it, nobody was encouraging you to make these mistakes because they were hurting other people, but it was in an environment where people were really committed to um, breaking down these ways of being that were causing friction within a community that was trying to work together. So I spent about 5 or 6 years doing this in a really intense way, and I'm still doing it. I really think it's one of those things that is you never get there. You're never at the place like, oh, okay, I am woke now. I understand this. Um, I can be an ally in every moment. It is a lifelong journey to try to counteract the the stuff that we get inputted with as kids about who we are in the world based on what we look like.
Yeah, and I think it even would extend through, genetically through our ancestors. Like that stuff is just unfortunately encoded, and it's just like continuing to bring that awareness. And I mean, I think just trying to give yourself the space to be okay when you've been wrong. And I think I- in my past, when I've struggled to make changes, is because I haven't accepted what has actually already happened. I've already
Yeah,
done the thing. So I can't say I wish I didn't do it, because I did do it. I have to make amends with it. Um, and it's hard sometimes, but it's like, what's the alternative? And I start to think
yeah,
about recently, um, what's happened. Obviously, the latest has been with George Floyd. I think a lot of white people are starting to understand that whatever, for me, whatever uncomfortableness I felt about choosing the right words, it's a fucking joke when compared to what any person of color has had to deal with. And so it's like, I can get over my little ego, can get over someone calling me out for not saying the right thing. They have their right to feel exactly how they feel. As long as
yeah,
I'm coming from a place of truth and being honest, that's all I can do, and stop worrying about it being perfect. It's not going to be perfect. But I need to start with listening, and then pay attention to what actions are arising, I guess. And so,
yeah. I mean, I think one of the great tragedies of our time is the way in which we have looked back at the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. I think there's this misconception that that was a movement um, that defeated racism, and what it did um, was nobody at that time was under the illusion that there wasn't racism. What the civil rights movement did is it managed to create this, um, almost consensus that racism is bad, that it's wrong. At the time that all the marches and sit-ins back then were taking place, it was easy enough to find white people in power who would just say, yeah, there we have segregation. It's because we are the superior race and we need to maintain this. And all that, and I don't say all because people died doing this and gave so much, but what they did was they exposed what racism really looked like. It was attack dogs, it was fire hoses. And when we reached the point where Martin Luther King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, I think what right around there became this critical mass of people who realized that was wrong. That was that this is not right. And instead of actually coming together as a society to dismantle it, to make reparations, to become a better, more equal place, we just decided, okay, let's all agree now racism is bad and move forward. And since, but we didn't do any of the work that we needed to change the way that systems were built, the way that wealth was allocated. And so now we are living with the failure to, in the last half century, move that forward. And we're actually, in some ways, when we talk about the people in ultimate power, we've moved considerably backwards in terms of what we're willing to tolerate from leadership. So that's where I think we're really struggling at this time.
And I think that, yeah, really well said. And, this is just fresh on my mind because we watched the Netflix documentary 13th,
Yeah.
which if anyone hasn't watched it, please watch it. It's powerful. But it really talks about how racism just got institutionalized and how it was the war on crime, the war on drugs. It was all these, and then, basically with, 13th, the 13th Amendment. I'm not a big historian, but it's the end of slavery. But they had a loophole in there that said, yeah, you're free unless you're convicted of a crime, and then you're a felon, and then you lose your ability to vote, and da 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 da. And basically, it became another way to have this institutionalized slavery, so to speak, and it just kept, going more and more underground, and the white leadership figuring out new ways to incarcerate and arguably enslave, you know, uh, minorities. And so, that's the thing. When you watch that documentary, it all makes sense why we're where we're at today. I don't want to hear, the population's 30% black and the prisons are 70% black. There's a reason for that. It's not because they're bad actors. It's because, as you know, one of the laws that was put into place when crack came out was that 1 ounce of crack cocaine was equal to 100 ounces of powder cocaine. And unless you're unaware, those two drugs hit two different groups significantly. There's not a ton of people that are in lower income socioeconomic situations that are going to use the powder. They're going to use the crack. It's cheaper. And so we don't need to go down that rabbit hole, but there's such inequality in just the sentencing. And I know this is something that you can speak to from your own experience. But these are the things that our brothers and sisters have been up against. And again, I'm just finally waking up to, right? And so I don't know. I don't need to know what the right thing to do is. I need to know that I don't know, and whatever shape it takes, I have to be okay with that. And so I don't know. I'm just curious. Your client Rolando, talk a little bit about what. Let's get into the documentary a little bit and kind of what he was charged with. Um, Kind of a little bit of
Sure.
his history.
It might be better to do Raphael
Okay,
for the reason that Rolando's case is still pending.
fair.
He's got a civil rights lawsuit that the film references at the end. But Raphael was somebody who had a hard start to his life and did the sort of things that I did, and responding to challenges and gravitating towards substances. And unlike me, he was in a time and a place in the world where that was heavily policed, and so he became somebody who got arrested for uh, being a drug offender. And once that happened, a lot of doors just slammed shut for him. So he went through recovery. He became a father, but he was in this position where I think he had these limitations on him, and he was in a relationship and he was trying to work through that, but he wanted to be a contributor. And the only real avenue for contribution based on his criminal record, which is like this scarlet letter we put on people, was to be somebody who kind of went back into the game. And so he had a confidential informant who somebody was working off, presumably one of their own cases where they were up against it. And they decided, oh, Raphael's had a case before. Maybe if I really kind of push him, I can get him to do a drug transaction. And then if I set him up, I'll go free. So he was eventually persuaded to be the middleman in a transaction where he stood to gain $50. And for that deal where he was going to make $50, the minimum mandatory, because he had a prior offense, was 5 years in state prison with 2 years on and after, because it happened 997 feet from the boundary of a school that wasn't in session at the time.
And I'm
So,
assuming 1,000 feet is the cutoff.
yep. So that's how our system deals with drug offenses. Now, I think one of the things that is in professionally, I have these limitations about what the kinds of arguments I can make and the kinds of things that I can say. But there's a great book out there, and there's a website that goes along with it called "We Are All Criminals." And I think the thing about the 13th is, as you mentioned, there's that amendment, one of the civil rights amendments at the end of the Civil War, basically said that servitude had been abolished, but for people who were convicted criminals. And the reality is that we are all the time doing things for which we could be prosecuted, and we have a system, and we have so many laws that it becomes discretionary. How is law enforcement going to enforce the law? And we have chosen to enforce the law and really fetishize street crime. A couple of years ago, these data scientists did this great project where they created the equivalent of what modern policing now is all about: algorithms and about mapping out social relationships in these poor neighborhoods and figuring out who's talking to who and what the connections are so that they can predict crime. And what these data scientists did was they said, why don't we take this same mindset and we'll apply it to white collar crime? And so we'll find where is white collar crime most likely happening? And if you go look at a map of New York, let's put in the red hot spots where we can think that crime's taking place. And oh, wait a minute, it's not up in Harlem; it's down here in on Wall Street. And I'm sure in Chicago, exactly where the neighborhoods are.
Fuck yeah.
Yeah, that kind of thing can happen. So we've just decided that we're going to, really make the Rafael Rodriguez's the ones that we're going to use our resources towards prosecuting. When you have people who are engaging in these white collar crime is a crime, and it has repercussions that are profound in terms of pensions and all different ways in which people's lives are hanging in the balance when corporate executives steal. But the amount of money, the amount of attention that gets put onto that is a fraction of what we have focused on, which just so happens to be crimes that poor people of color are more likely to commit than people with Ivy League degrees.
Yeah, and it's that brings to mind this. I don't know if people are aware of this, but I believe it's 95% of cases are plea bargained. And so just give people the kind of the reason what happens to these people who are arrested and they're charged, and they're basically given two options. You can either plea bargain, or we'll do this to you.
Yeah, I mean, we have set up a system um, where the government charges people, but the government there's everybody has a constitutional right to a lawyer. If there's a possibility that you could go to jail, you are entitled to have a lawyer provided to you, if even if you were too poor to have one on your own. So the government, the Constitution, who we are as a people, the Supreme Court has interpreted that. Gideon v. Wainwright, 1960. I'm going to say three, might be 61. Um, that's the rule. That's who we are. That's who we've decided we are. But to fulfill that constitutional obligation, we have come up with systems across the country where public defenders are so overwhelmed. These jurisdictions are known as meet 'em and plead 'em. The public defender goes down into lockup, meets the defendant, and says, "Look, nice to meet you, sir or ma'am. I've been appointed to represent you, and I just talked to the DA, and they are going to offer you 6 months on this case. You're facing, a possible penalty of 2.5 years. Seems like this is probably the best we're going to be able to do. If you push it here, the DA said that offer's off the table." And so I think now is really it's take it or leave it time. And the person who's standing on the other side of those bars is saying, I didn't do this. I didn't do it. I don't know why I'm here. Or yeah, I was in that fight, but he hit me first. Look, I'm the one with the black eye here. Like, I was defending myself, and the public defender is so overwhelmed that they're not in a position to do any investigation, and they're going to say, "Look, all right, you're going to be held probably longer than 6 months before you have that trial. So even if you beat the rap, you don't beat that ride down from the street to the jail and into lockup into the pretrial facility where you're going to be." So every day across this country, people take those deals, whether they did it or not, or whether they have these things in mitigation that should be said for them. That lawyers, and it's not the lawyers' fault. The lawyers are doing the best they can. Those public defenders, by and large, are a group of people who are doing what they do because they have this commitment to helping the least among us. But we've set it up in a way where they really can't do their job in a way that is fair and gets just results. And so that's why we have 95% of cases ending up at pleas, is because there aren't enough lawyers who represent the poor, and we have a system where people are held pretrial instead of out at liberty. If you're in jail, David Hoos, I mentioned it before, he said the most important point in any criminal case is at that arraignment. If the defendant gets held on a high bail and they can't come out, it warps the whole process, and they either plead it out that day, or that first pretrial conference 30 days later, they'll take the best they can get, because they just can't, in these less serious cases, afford the consequences of waiting for their day in court.
Well, not only that, they have jobs now; they can't go to their job, and then it's it's interesting. You mentioned the high bail and just bail in general. That is something that is, again, just kind of, as I'm combing through like ways that people can help. there are some bail organizations that are doing, it seems to be some good work. Can you talk about that? Like what, like the benefits of that, and what other organizations people are want to put their time and money behind? What would you suggest?
Yeah, so there is a national bail fund organization in every state, I believe, has local chapters. And basically, what they do is um, bail is what happens when a person is charged and the judge says, all right, um, I need to have some assurance that you're going to come back. And so if I make you pay some money, the idea is if you run, if you don't show up, if you default, we'll take your money. And so they put these bails on people as a way to kind of ensure that they'll come back, but oftentimes they're set at amounts that poor people can't pay. So they end up in jail with a $500 bail, and they just don't. Most Americans do not have access to $500. About They did a study a couple of years ago, and that amount of money is just off limits to so many people. So if you're charged with something and they set that kind of bail, then you're stuck in jail until your next court appearance, which is probably not going to be for another month. So there are these organizations out there, these bail funds, and what they will do is they will look at these kind of minor cases and they'll say, all right, you don't have the $500, we'll put it up for you. We'll put up that $500, and when you come back and the case is eventually resolved, we'll take it back and put it in the fund. And what's amazing about this are two things. One is people rarely ever run. They are coming back, particularly when people they don't know are coming into court and saying, we'll put up the 500. The You've heard there's no honor among thieves. Well, there is honor among people who are charged, who have bail funds work with them. The second thing that's amazing that happens statistically is a lot of these cases end up getting flat out dismissed or acquittals. They're bad cases that the government can't prove. The only thing they can do is they can hold people and then cause those people to have to plead it out because they can't take any more pretrial detention. So that is these bail funds right now in this moment that are being used for protesters are great, and I'm a big proponent of it, and I think, but when the protests stop, these continue to be organizations that are doing really good work, that are causing a real dent in prison populations. So I think that's a great way to you know contribute financially, is to find a bail fund, volunteer at a bail fund. If you can't financially contribute, they need people to go post the money, to sign things, and they're just a really, my experience is a really great group of people who have who have a really good understanding of the ways in which the system uses a person's poverty against them.
Yeah, and I love the idea too that with the that this fund can, it doesn't necessarily get drained. You know, as people come back and show up, the money comes back, and it can actually, the more people give, it can actually grow and help more people. It's not just like every year it needs to get another X amount of dollars to kind of replenish the funding.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we're living through now with these protests, and I think nobody has seen anything like this since Ferguson. When Ferguson happened, when Michael Brown was killed, I think that caught the country off guard in a lot of ways, and it wasn't one of those ones that happened on camera, and people just from the outside looking in, myself included, are like, why is this like the case that everybody is? Why was this like the match? Where was the gasoline in that environment that caused that to detonate? And so that question was on the mind of the Justice Department. The United States Justice Department went to Ferguson to try to do an investigation and say, why did everybody get so upset here with this one particular case? And what they found was Ferguson, Missouri, had decided to fund its municipality with fees and fines for just the most piddling shit. But there was like a quota system in place where a mostly white police force was just ticketing the fuck out of a mostly black population. They were hitting them with, it's called cash register justice. They'd give them a fine on jaywalking, and then a fine for not paying your fine, and a surf fine on your fine, or a fine for um, uh, failing to pay your parking tickets, or it was that kind of piddling stuff. But it would be like disorderly conduct, and they would give you a year's probation, and there would be a probation fee, or it'd be a possession of marijuana case, and there'd be a drug analysis fee. And so that population was a piggy bank. The poorest folks became the source for which this municipality funded all of its operations. They called it user fees. For the privilege of being prosecuted, we're just going to suck the living shit out of a whole community. And was that's what the Justice Department found was a precursor to this explosion happening. You had people who were so pissed off, and rightfully so, from being used to by the system, that when something like that happened, then you have these explosions.
Actually, I had no idea that that's what was going on there. Wow. I mean, not surprised, but that's it, right? Like, we're not surprised. Like, that's what's super fucked up, is we're not surprised. Like, that's why it's time for those of us who say they don't want to hear from a white person. It's like, no, we need to stand beside our brothers and sisters. They need that voice, because unfortunately that's the one that's often heard.
Yeah, I mean, it's so complicated.
It's so complicated.
And again, it's so complicated, and mistakes are going to happen, and people sometimes. I think you touched on it before, but I think that the phrase that I think is a big challenge here, that we all can be guilty of, is this white fragility. Like we step out with the best of intentions, and we realize we get feedback that is totally different from what we thought. We thought we were doing a good thing because we were using our voice, and as it turns out, we were using it to drown out the voice of a person of color, or a woman, or a person who is poor, or has some other way in which they are underprivileged. So those moments are going to happen, and I think what we can't get caught up in is this kind of defensive mentality of, but I didn't mean that. I didn't mean to hurt your feelings, or step on your toes, or diminish your voice. I was trying to add to your voice, and listen, and just say, all right, thank you for giving me that feedback, because I really do want my good intentions to have good results, and maybe next time I can use what I'm learning here to make that happen. And I think the key thing here, that where you really want to see things change, is not putting it on people of color to educate us. The more white people can take some of that load off of people of color, so that that it's not their job to educate us, that we can learn and approach each other in ways that are loving, and that are not about like, I'm more woke than you, but like, hey, here's what I noticed, and I've done this, like I've been in this position, and maybe this is one of those things that you might want to get this feedback, because it'll make you a better ally the next time. Those conversations are really, really hard, but I think those are super important if we're going to be good allies. We can't just rely on our intentions. We have to perpetually be open to the idea that what we think we're doing well is something we're actually doing poorly.
Yeah, exactly. And we are going to get criticism, and that's, as you said, that's positive feedback for us. So it's like, put the ego aside. This is not about someone trying to prove you wrong. And if they are, then they have the right to feel the way they feel. But what is your intention? Your intention is to do good. Okay. Then if someone is giving you feedback that what you're doing is not good, then pay attention and say, again, it's
Yeah.
like, what can I, again, back to this idea, like, we don't know.
Right.
There are so many things we can't know, and we have to rely on your friends that are in this situation. What can I do?
Right. I mean, one thing, like I said before, like public defenders, people do this work, they go into it with really, really great values. Like when I talked before about these meet 'em and plead 'em kind of jurisdictions where they're doing triage, studies show that public defenders, like prosecutors, like judges, like police officers, when they are looking at their case, like what's the case that I'm actually going to litigate, it matters what their defendant looks like, their client looks like. If they are a person of color, particularly if they are a dark person of color, if they are within the African American community, if they are darker skinned, studies show that public defenders tend to look at that file and be like, yeah, I'm going to put that one to the side. And so it is everywhere. It really is the sort of thing like there was a great movie not too long ago about a lawyer named Rob Bilott, who was a corporate attorney. It's called Dark Waters. Mark Ruffalo now stars in it. But it's about Teflon and how Teflon was this wonder invention that gave us nonstick pans in the 50s. The only problem was what they did with the toxic waste was they started just dumping it in these places to the point where now every single living organism on the planet has some of this shit in their system. That's how I think about racism. That is what it is, so out there that it's in all of us. And it's not just in white people either. I mean, you will see people of color who will speak very intelligently about the ways in which their own internalized oppression causes them to do things that they didn't wish. So we are all fighting this toxin that is in all of us, and if we don't, it's gonna cause the kind of harm that it's been causing for the last 400 years.
Yeah, well said. Well, let's shift gears. Let's get into the documentary a little bit, and I don't want to take too much of your time, and so can you lay out for people just in general, what was happening, and I'll poke and prod a few questions along the way, but give them a little background if they haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, sure. So back in the summer of 2012, there were two main places in the state of Massachusetts where unknown substances believed to be narcotics were seized and they were deposited for forensic analysis. One was in Boston called the Hinton Drug Laboratory, and one was in Amherst in the western part of the state on the campus of the University of Massachusetts. And basically, in every criminal case, every drug case, one of the things that the government has to prove is that the substance in question is, in fact, a narcotic, that it's illegal to possess, it's a controlled substance. And a surprisingly high number of things that the police seize turn out not to be. Anywhere between 5 and 10% of what they pick up turns out to be a beat bag or some. They bust through the door on a word of a snitch and somebody's got their Betty Crocker cake mix out there and the police grab it. And there are lots of examples if you want to go online and look for it. There was one woman down in Georgia who spent about 70 days in jail. She got pulled over on the side of the road and they did a test on the side of the road. They saw this thing in a bag and it was blue and they grabbed it and they did a test and it came back positive for meth. And that woman went to jail on $1 million bond for 70 days until they sent it to the laboratory. And the laboratory with the person with the white coats, they looked at it and they found exactly what this woman had been telling them, that this blue thing that she went to jail for 70 days was cotton fucking candy.
No.
Yeah. So you have these moments that happen where these lab technicians are so important in terms of figuring out, was this an actual crime? So in the Boston laboratory, there was a chemist there by the name of Annie Dukin, and she was kind of viewed herself as a cop in a lab coat. And she gloried in the idea that she could do more samples than anybody else, and her numbers were off the charts. And the reason she was able to do so many samples is she didn't actually do the tests. She would just look at that bag of blue stuff and she'd be like, oh yeah, that looks like meth to me. And she would write meth or cocaine or heroin. So she was dry labbing is what it was called. Or in some cases where somebody would check her work and be like, hey, you know what? This is actually cotton candy. She'd be like, let me see that. And she would take from another sample of actual meth, and she would introduce it and be like, no, why don't you test it again? I got meth here. And they'd be like, oh yeah, I guess it is meth. So that's what she was doing. And she got caught doing it, and she confessed to doing it. And it created this huge problem for the whole criminal justice system because she had been so prolific and she had signed her name on so many of these cases that you were literally in a position of wondering, there are tens and thousands of people who are impacted, and the system, nobody knew who they were, and it was this huge crisis in the criminal justice system. So I practice out in the western part of the state, and we're kind of the hinterlands. The folks in Boston really look at us like they're country cousins. And we, at our drug lab in January of 2013, one of the chemists there was a woman named Sonia Farrick, and she got arrested for stealing and tampering with drugs. And the immediate response to that of law enforcement was, whew, thank God we caught her right when she started doing this, and that this wasn't another Annie Dukin case. So just trust us. This is, she was a just dedicated employee who was doing all the right things right up into that moment where we put the handcuffs on, because we caught it in time. And I had clients who were affected who had Sonia Farrick cases. And I was like, wait a minute, how can we possibly know that? And they're like, just trust us. And so the documentary is about in Boston, like trying to figure out how to give, like, our system of justice is set up on an individual basis, but this was 25,000 people. Like, how do you deal with a crisis that implicates that many people? And then out in Amherst, like the series tracks the experience of trying to get to the bottom of how long, in fact, this chemist was doing it. If the state was right about this initial out of the gate proclamation that nobody's due process rights were violated. And, not to spoil it, but yeah, it turns out it was not just in the nick of time. She'd been doing this day in, day out for nearly a decade.
Yeah, and so they had it. They had tried to cut their losses and say what is about 4 months that they of convictions or of lab reports.
Yeah. So what had happened was the Attorney General herself, Martha Coakley, the day after Sonia Farrick's arrest, did a press conference and said, nobody's rights have been violated in any way. As that weeks kind of pass and months kind of pass, there were these random retests that they did where they could find, like 6 months before, there was a sample that Sonia Farrick got where it tested for very pure cocaine, and then they retested it at another lab and they found that it just had the trace amounts of cocaine. And so judges looked at that, and the government kind of looked at that, and they said, yeah, she probably tampered with that too, but we couldn't prove that she had tampered with anything before then. So they basically came up with this paradigm where if you had a case that was resolved before July 2012, it was SOL for you. You were just, there was no way that you were entitled to any kind of relief on the ground that a government agent in your case engaged in egregious misconduct.
And again, I don't want to give too much of it away, but just paint a picture for people who aren't in the law field of how rare the charge of misconduct that was given to the assistant attorney general. That was it Chris Foster and Ann Kaczmarek?
Yeah. So basically, what ended up happening was we had this in 2013, these hearings to try to figure out the timing and scope of Sonia Farrick's misconduct. And after a judge came up with this paradigm of July 2012 is when it started, it turned out that I was able to get access to some evidence that I'd been denied, and was able to push that date back further, and learned about the existence of yet more records, which would show that it did, in fact, as I said before, start in August of 2004. So we had this hearing in December of 2016 that's featured in the film, where me and some other attorneys brought in actors from the state police and from the attorney general's office, and a judge issued an opinion in June of 2017 saying that two particular assistant attorneys general perpetrated a fraud on the court. And so that um, that was rare. Like most, it is not that rare when a court will find that the government hid evidence. That happens. It happens a kind of a shocking amount, and sometimes it's because the prosecutors are really just trying to bury things and railroad people. But I think more often than not, it's because they too are overworked and they don't understand why something would be exculpatory, why it would be like a key piece of evidence. And so they put things under the rug. But for the people whose lives are turned upside down by this, obviously, whether they did it intentionally or negligently, um, they're the ones who are suffering in jail. But even in the cases where the courts find that prosecutors deliberately withheld important exculpatory evidence, there's kind of this professional courtesy that they do where they don't name the prosecutors. They write these opinions and they say the prosecutor or the assistant district attorney. And so the fact that there was even an opinion that named names was extraordinary. And so it's one of the great frustrations, I think, of doing the work that I do, that people can make these decisions that really harm the people that I'm representing and that I grow to really care about, and that there aren't any repercussions, so to speak, of in almost all the cases.
Yeah, I'm gonna leave it at that, because I really want people to go watch the documentary, because it. You said that you were denied. I think that is one of the gross understatements. The way that they kept this evidence and whatever they were doing to try to protect themselves is almost unfathomable. And so I think the documentary did an amazing job, just from a viewer standpoint, of really showing your frustration, but also your ability to just like say, fuck it. Like there's something's not right. Something's not right. And the way you kind of followed the breadcrumbs was pretty amazing. And so I'll leave the listeners to go watch that on their own. But really give us this, from the time that it came apparent in Amherst that there was some misconduct, to what was that? Was it 4 years? What was the kind of?
Sure. So Sonia Farrick got arrested in January of 2013. She ended up pleading guilty in January of 2014. I found the first smoking gun in the case in October of 2014. I then joined forces with another attorney who's not featured all that prominently in the docu series, but her name ought to ring out. She is one of the great unsung heroes. Her name's Rebecca Jacob Stein. She's a full-time public defender. Just became this person in my life that um, we sent so many emails back and forth. Had so many phone calls. I mean, my law partners did not see as much of me as Rebecca did for years. So she and I found additional evidence in March of 2015. There was then an investigation as to why the evidence was suppressed that resulted in April of 2016 with a finding that I was the only one that did anything wrong.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Which again, I think is one of those moments, and for people who watch the series, you'll see me like I'm like even recounting it, getting all worked up, like they said I did something wrong. That was so important for me after the fact, in that there was this police report. It was 15 pages, and it just basically the upshot was that I engaged in unprofessional, negligent, and baseless conduct, and it was misrepresentations. It was failure to appreciate what actually they were finding. But at the end of the day, I was so upset, and after like days of like my face being beat red and just furious, I had this epiphany. Like, I have so many clients who show up and I hand them the police report and they're like, that didn't happen. I'm like, yeah, I get it. I get it. But I never got it until then. Like, to see your own name on a police report with just a bunch of lies is so upsetting. It's the official narrative. And for, as an attorney, so many times I think I just kind of was like, yeah, don't worry about it. That they're not going to be able to introduce that into any evidence. And they're like, but this is a police report. I'm like, yeah, yeah, it's trust me, we'll bring that out at trial. And but it's a big deal when somebody creates a official document and totally just misrepresents who you are and what you've done. So that was a part of the journey. And then it wasn't until the following summer, June 2016, when a judge in these individual cases ruled there'd been a fraud upon the court. And then that fall, Rebecca kept going with this, and managed to convince the Supreme Judicial Court. They issued a decision in October of 2018 that just wiped out what turned out to be about 16,000 of the Amherst cases, convictions that were overturned and vacated and dismissed.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. And yeah, for you to just to go through that experience, like it's one of the things I talk about on the podcast is uh, we can only know so much from hearing about something, and I think that's a perfect example. Like
Yeah.
you had your own experience, like motherfucker, I get it now. I finally get it. We don't get
Yeah.
it until we have the experience, and we can fool ourselves into thinking we do, but we don't. And I think that's a
Yeah.
perfect example of the importance of, really trying to put yourself in someone else's shoes, because you can be dismissive. You're just like, yeah, we got bigger fish to fry almost. But they're like, this is fucking
Yeah.
important to me. And you're like, now I
Yeah.
get it. They're actually
Yep.
calling your integrity, into question. And you're like, well, what the
Right.
fuck?
Right.
So along those
Yeah.
lines, and maybe that's it. Or, one of the things I'm trying to be more mindful of with the podcast is, you know, as you and I know, we can't change anything, whether it's our long held beliefs, these ideas about how we're supposed to be in the world, until we become aware of them. And so
Yeah.
I think awareness is a big key. And for me, I've had a few different kind of awakenings that have really helped reorient me in my own life and to see things differently. Um, do you have a point that really that you could point to that just shifted you, um, that allowed you to view things, your lives, your beliefs, as not your own, and things that were given to
Mm.
you in a sense? Or even is there
Uh,
something today that you're just like kind of turning over in your mind, like this is I don't I've been I felt like this for 40 some odd years, but I don't even think this is me.
yeah. I mean, I talked about it earlier, and I think that was more, somebody in my mid 20s who was trying to figure out who I was, and the ways in which I was letting a past trauma kind of dictate my personality. I think one of the things that and this, I don't think it's as, um, it's not as big a shift, but I think it's one of those things that in the long run is going to be real important for me, that I've really come to appreciate. And that's, there is so much ugliness in the world. And my job, as I view it, is to try to make it a little bit less ugly. That's the best that I can do when I'm in a court. Like, I'm not painting the Mona Lisa when I'm trying a case. I'm trying to prevent something bad has already happened. I'm trying to make it a little less bad.
Yeah.
Um, and I think I'm comfortable with that as like my lot in life. Like, that's the what I'm kind of, that's my calling to do. But I think for even those of us who have that kind of calling, we have to kind of find ways, to be around beauty and to be around people who are creating beauty. My wife is a potter, and and I can't tell you how like sustaining it is to participate in the small way that I do with helping her bring these just beautiful works of art into the world. She's got a wood fired kiln, and so she spends all this time on the wheel. She throws them and she glazes them, and but at the end of the day, there's like this amazing, like it's almost like a barn raising from like 18th century, where a group of people come together and spend 24 straight hours throwing wood into this just huge oven, and listening to the fire, and being a part of a process that at the end of it creates these beautiful works of art. And I think that um, in order to do the kind of make the world less ugly kind of work in a way that you don't burn out, I think you have to find your ways in life to be around the people who are making beautiful things. And that's my recent thing is like some, you know, that if I mean, you got to take care of yourself. You got to exercise. You got to do all this, but just to be in the presence of people whose calling is balances that out is I think important. So I think we all can find ways to be around beauty and be around community. Like find those things like that firing that brings people together who are working shifts and chucking wood and stacking wood. Like all of that is a um, makes me feel like I've got a chance at doing this longer than I otherwise would.
I love that. That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for so much for being on here, brother. It's great to see you.
This was absolutely my pleasure, and Cal, congratulations for doing this. I think I know a little bit about your story, and I know I'm not the first podcast, but I really admire what the choices you're making about your life and about it's very easy to just kind of stay with what you've been doing in life and to make big changes and to ask big questions. Um, you know, has ripple effects out there for
Mm.
a lot of people. So thank you for that and for extending this invitation.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you. I love you, man. Great to see
All
you.
right.